About our mission, I think you all know it. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're not affiliated with any university. Luis and I are both professors, and we align ourselves with various programs with colleges and universities. We did it with FAU, we did it with Palm Beach State College, but we are independent, and we'd like to keep it that way, and I think that is our strength. We like to be a place for academics, scholars, writers, those who want to write or say something frankly, in a nonpartisan way, in an intellectual way, where we can help move the issues along, so to speak, and be able, in that sense, to offer suggestions if we need to policymakers, and to be a place where you don't have to be afraid to write what's on your mind.
I want to thank everyone again for being here. I'm so happy. I think we have a terrific attendance, and we want to thank you for your generosity tonight. Just a few things that I want to add. The reason why we created this center is because, first of all, there is no such a center in the area of Palm Beach County or in South Florida. We have institutes that are linked to universities, but they actually stay within the walls of the universities. We don't have a think tank that is an open think tank that actually creates ideas and has a direct connection to public officials. And this is what we are trying to do. Major cities actually have think tanks. You know, Washington, obviously, every think tank is there, not ours. New York has think tanks, LA has think tanks, and probably a few other. Miami has a few think tanks, but they are very specific, and some of them actually don't even use English as a first language, or they don't publish in English. So the idea was, we believe that this area needed a think tank, particularly for the quality of people that it has. You know? We believe that there are also important intellectual resources here. Not only that we have a set of people who are working in the academia, professors, many of whom actually write for us, you know, like Dr. Olmer, one of them, Dr. Rabil, who is well known and recognized nationwide for his writings on the Middle East. We have people like Victor Combras, who is a former ambassador, special envoy on monitoring terrorism and sanctions on terrorists in the United Nations. But we also have people who have moved and, you know, found in retirement a new place in Florida. And that could be people who actually were ambassadors at one point, or they had any position in government, or any position in one of the agencies in the country. People who have something to contribute to the ideas, to the general ideas. And as Steven Sussman actually pointed out, the idea here is bring all kinds of ideas. We don't have an orientation. We are not conservative, we are not liberal, we are not right, we are not left. We have a dialogue between ideas.
With that, I want to introduce our speaker, Gordon Chang. He's got a tremendous background. For those guys who've looked into his bio, very well accomplished in terms of speaking both domestically and abroad. Has spoken to CIA, Pentagon, State Department, Rand Institute, Brookings, AEI, the list goes on and on. Quite often on media in terms of talking about China policy. Published several pieces on his views on the challenge with China. I think it's very thematic, very important for us to pay attention to this, because I think the private sector, whether you're still active, whether you're retired, whether you have kids in academia or whatnot, every facet of that is going to get impacted. The great power struggle of the 20th century was Russia and us. The great power struggle of the 21st century, Iran and Russia will be a pain, and it will be an issue that we'll have to manage with, as well as the terrorism issue. The systematic issue, I think, is China. So with that, I want to introduce Gordon Chang and have him discuss his thoughts on China.
Well, thank you, Hamlet, and thank you to the center, Stephen, Luis. and thank you all for coming today. China challenges the United States. And unfortunately, this challenge is existential. I've been asked to talk about two topics tonight. The first is China's hacking our networks and stealing our intellectual property. The second topic is going to be China's Belt and Road program, and more generally, the geopolitical ambitions of Xi Jinping, the ruler of the country. On the first topic, we're going to start 6 days ago. First day of the year, January 1st. On that day, China's encryption law became effective. A month before, on December 1st, Beijing implemented its multi-level protection scheme 2.0. This was under the authority of China's cybersecurity law of 2016. These measures prohibit foreign companies from encrypting data so that the Chinese central government and the Communist Party of China cannot read it. So these measures, they force foreign companies to turn over encryption keys to Chinese authorities, and they prohibit companies from using VPNs, virtual private networks, to keep data secret. Most people believe that when Beijing starts to fully enforce these measures, they will also outlaw private servers. So together, these two measures, January 1st, December 1st, these measures give the Chinese government the ability to seize all data, all communications that are stored on servers located in China. And so together, these two measures give China full visibility. And this full visibility has two extremely disadvantageous consequences. So first of all, under existing Chinese law, the Ministry of State Security, once it takes all this data from foreign companies, can turn it over to state enterprises that, by the way, compete with us. So these state enterprises will take this data that China has seized and weaponize it against us. The second thing that will happen is that once China's officials have these encryption keys and once they're inside the China networks of foreign companies, they will be in a position to steal data from the outside of China networks of these companies. So we have seen this before. So for instance, Canada's Nortel Networks, a leading telecom equipment provider, was bankrupted after it was, as people say, hacked to pieces. So when we think about what we as a nation will do to oppose the January 1 and December 1 rules of China, we've got to ask ourselves one question. Do we want China to actually take over the entire Fortune 500? Now, President Trump's Phase 1 trade deal, which is going to be signed on the 15th of this month, does have protections for intellectual property. We know that China each year steals hundreds of billions of dollars of US IP. This is the conclusion that one gets after reading the 2013 report on the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. That's more commonly known as the Blair-Huntsman Commission. Also, you can look at the 2018 report of the US Trade Representative. And both of those reports were updated last year. Larry Kudlow, who was President Trump's senior economic advisor, doesn't seem to know about these rules. He seemed flustered when Maria Bartiromo of Fox News on her Sunday show in the middle of last month asked him about this. So we've got an issue. Now, of course, there is no point in the United States having intellectual property protections in a Phase 1 trade deal if that deal does not address these December 1 and January 1 rules. So China wants all the world's data, and looks like it has the means to get it. And it's not just because of these new rules that Beijing is implementing. It's also because the world is transitioning from the fourth generation, 4G, the fourth generation of wireless communication, to the fifth. And why is this important? Well, 5G will have speeds 2,000 times faster than 4G. And that means there will be almost universal connectivity in the world. Homes, machines, robots, vehicles will all be connected to what we call the Internet of Things in a 5G world. Now, there are two ominous implications of 5G. First of all, now the devices that are connected to these fifth-generation networks are going to produce an enormous amount of data. So whoever controls these networks will be in a position to take this data, unprecedented amounts of it. Second of all, just think about it. All the devices in the world connected to the internet. That means someone who controls the networks over which this data flows will be in a position to remotely influence these devices. So for instance, whoever controls these networks could drive your self-connected car off the cliff. It could unlock your front door. It could speed up or slow down your pacemaker. We got a warning of this just about 3 or 4 days ago when we saw these stories appearing about how someone was manipulating these home surveillance cameras, looking at the nurseries. That, of course, was a warning. But as bad as that is, and it really is horrendous, but as bad as this is, there's something even more consequential. Those who control the networks will, in a time of war, be able to peer into almost every corner around the world and be able to paralyze critical infrastructure. So who wants to give somebody else the power to surveil everyone, to take data, to remotely influence events, and perhaps to win a war? Well, suppose that person was China. We don't really have to suppose too much because China is almost there. Nowhere is America so far behind China when it comes to 5G. Not since the invention of gunpowder has China led the introduction around the world of a disruptive technology. And we Americans have yet to come to terms with being leapfrogged by Beijing. The Chinese have raced ahead in 5G for one very simple reason, and that is they have made it a central plank of their industrial policies. So for instance, 5G is included in the 13th five-year plan, which covers the half-decade ending this year. It's also a part of Xi Jinping's Made in 2025 initiative. And since May 2017, 5G has been part of Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, because in that month he announced something called the Digital Silk Road. Now, Beijing's tool for information dominance is Huawei Technologies. It is the world's largest manufacturer of telecom network gear. It is also the world's second largest maker of smartphones. Huawei is far ahead of any other company in the world in installing 5G networks. Matter of fact, it only really has two competitors that offer a comprehensive solution. That is Ericsson of Sweden and Nokia of Finland. Huawei, unlike Ericsson and Nokia, is a tool for state spying. The company's name translates into for China. And Huawei is in no position to resist China's demands for information gathering. First of all, Beijing owns Huawei. Huawei says that it is quote-unquote employee-owned, but that's an exaggeration. Founder Ren Zhengfei owns 1% of Huawei. The other 99% is controlled by the Chinese central government through an entity that's called a trade union committee. Even more important than this, under the Communist Party's system, no person, no entity can resist a demand from the party to do anything, including spying. And third of all, there is the 2017 National Intelligence Law. Article 7 and 14 of that law make it a legal obligation for any Chinese national or entity to spy for the Ministry of State Security if demanded. Now, these spying concerns, they're not just theoretical. We know that in the half-decade, 2012 to 2017, China nightly surreptitiously downloaded data from the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, that building that China built and which Beijing donated to the African Union. And by the way, China did that through Huawei servers that were donated to the AU. Also, Huawei has been positioning itself to take the data of tomorrow. Christopher Balding, an academic who recently had to flee China, did a study of the resumes of Huawei employees and found that many of them showed connections to the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, in roles that involved intelligence gathering. Moreover, Ren Zhongfei, who is the founder of Huawei, was an officer in the PLA until he was demobilized in 1983, and today he is currently a member of the Communist Party. Also, people have looked at Huawei software. Finite State, which is a cybersecurity firm, actually did a scan of almost 10,000 images of Huawei firmware and found that 55% of those images had at least one backdoor vulnerability. People who have looked at Huawei servers and software have found that it has more backdoor vulnerabilities than any other company. Now, the reason why Huawei has been able to dominate 5G around the world so far is because it is able to provide equipment at much reduced prices. Generally 20%, maybe 30% below Ericsson, some cases 40% below Ericsson. It can do that for two reasons: subsidies and stealing. China has provided Huawei, whoever owns it, it is a national champion. So China has provided subsidies to Huawei. A recent Wall Street Journal investigation put those subsidies at the amount of $75 billion. In addition to the subsidies, there's stealing. Huawei has, from its very inception, formed in 1987, from its very inception has been stealing the technology of foreign companies, obviously most famously from Cisco Systems. Huawei, according to a recent Justice Department allegation, is still continuing to steal US intellectual property for product development purposes. So Americans need to know Huawei's game. Tech guru David Goldman has said, look, China wants to control broadband, it wants to control e-commerce, e-finance, it wants to control tech startups so that it can dominate the ecosystem, and it wants to control the logistics of the Internet of Things. As he told me, Huawei wants China to become the world's company store. We also have to talk about artificial intelligence in this regard. With so much data that China will be able to take, it means that anything else being equal, that China's AI will be so much more powerful than ours. China's advantage is its size, its data collection, and also its national determination. And Alison Graham of Harvard's Kennedy School says that when you look at these things, that's the reason why China in the past decade has been able to close the gap with American companies that once dominated AI. And Graham Allison believes that essentially China in the decade ahead is on a trajectory to overtake us. And while we're on the subject of being overtaken by China, we should take a look at that other area of technology, which is quantum. There is a quantum revolution coming, and China is in the forefront of it. This weird behavior of atoms and subatomic particles gives countries the ability to create computers with unimaginable power, as well as the possibility of unhackable communications. Now, the Chinese are already in the lead when it comes to communications. And that's because of something that Einstein identified, the spooky phenomena of distance, where particles separated even at great distance for some reason that we don't know, but these particles move in tandem with each other. China has figured out how to do this, how to harness that for the purposes of communication. Fortunately, there's another quantum area which is more important. That's quantum computing. That's one area where the United States is still ahead. The world's leader in this is Google. They recently unveiled a 72 quantum bit computer. China is still trying to produce a 24-bit one. But it's now time to understand that China has made great strides and in many areas is ahead of us. Let's take a look at this tech competition and put it into some context, because China clearly has some grand ambitions. Its Belt and Road Initiative is often cited as an area showing its grand ambitions. Belt and Road is essentially a combination of two initiatives, both which were announced by Xi Jinping in 2013 to connect China to Europe. But since that time, Belt and Road has been expanded to connect China to the world. I worry about China in many areas, but not particularly in Belt and Road. And the reason is, I worked in a law firm in Hong Kong, and I didn't do infrastructure work, but my firm did. And I can tell you that all the bankable infrastructure in Asia has already been built by the private sector. What China is doing with Belt and Road, it is building an infrastructure for geopolitical dominance, not economic dominance. Belt and Road is going to cause China a little bit of a problem. Let me tell you, the belt in Belt and Road is the land route connecting China to Europe through Central Asia, and is primarily railroads. I think that China's belt investments will become obsolete in about a half decade. And the reason is that the Arctic ice cap is receding. Shipping companies are already doing trial runs across the north coast of Russia, and in about 5 years they will be starting regular runs. When they do that, they will be able, shipping companies will be able to take goods from China, put them into Europe at the same speed as the railroads across Central Asia. But because it's done by ship, it means it's so much cheaper. But China wants the belt portion not because it's economically viable. They know all this. They want it because they have broader goals in mind. So for instance, in a recent military exercise, the Chinese were shipping tanks by rail through Central Asia. China, of course, wants to sell to Central Asia, so it will use the belt portion of the Belt and Road Initiative to buy raw materials, sell goods, but that is not economically viable. And that's why Belt and Road is being criticized in China itself. But as we mentioned, this shows the breadth of Chinese ambitions. And we have to understand how broad China's ambitions are. Today, almost all who comment about foreign policy in the world will tell you that China is just competing with the United States because it wants to extend its influence in the international system. So the current narrative is, oh, China's trying to bend that system more to its liking to get more influence in it. I think these analyses misconstrue China's ambition to the United States. And they misconstrue and underestimate China's challenge to the existing international order. That order traces itself to 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, which recognizes the sovereignty of countries. And today, these countries compete and cooperate with each other in a framework largely developed after the Second World War of treaties, conventions, rules, and norms. Chinese officials don't see it that way. Chinese officials believe that they have the right to dominate others, especially those on their periphery. And they're starting to talk in terms of the imperial era concepts. In the imperial era, China believed that other countries, other peoples, had an obligation to acknowledge Chinese rule. In short, Chinese emperors believed that they had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven. They believed that they were predestined and ordered to rule the entire world. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping has these ambitions of Tianxia, of imposing this model on others. And of course, this is sort of natural, because a dictatorial system naturally likes a dictatorial world order, and Tianxia, by its very top-down nature, is indeed dictatorial. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been employing Tianxia language for more than a decade, but recently it's become unmistakable. So for instance, in his 2017 New Year's message, he wrote, quote, "The Chinese have always held that the world is united and all under heaven are one family." And if this weren't bad enough, Xi Jinping had his foreign minister, Wang Yi, write an article in Study Times, which is the influential newspaper of the Central Party School. This article was in September 2017, and Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought, and in Communist Party lingo, a thought is an important ideological body of work. Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought made innovations on and transcended Western international relations thinking of the past 300 years. Take 2017, subtract 300 years, you almost get to 1648. And Wang Yi, by using the word transcended, was signaling that Xi Jinping thought that essentially there need be no more countries in the world, or at least there need be no more countries than China. So this trend of Xi Jinping's comments and those of who work for him indicate that China indeed is not trying to adjust the current Westphalian system. It is trying to overthrow it, which means China is once again, like it was in the Maoist era, is now ruled by a revolutionary. Xi Jinping not only spouts Tianxia-like statements, he employs dozens of scholars to study the application of Tianxia to today's world, and he acts like a Tianxia emperor. For 4 decades, American presidents have tried to integrate China into the international system. But that policy has failed. Not only has this policy of integration failed, we can see this because China under Xi Jinping is moving back to totalitarianism and militancy. The Chinese regime challenges America across all domains. It's being even bold enough these days to openly talk in public with glee about how it wants to kill Americans in the thousands. Moreover, China is not just talking about people's war on the US, which it did in May of last year. It is also starting to harm American service personnel, injuring 2 of them in 2018. It's also going after our diplomats, causing brain injuries at about the same time. So there seems to be no end to China's malign activities. So we are involved in a struggle with China. And this is not a struggle for domination. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a struggle for us to maintain our existence. So what do we do? 2 things. First, I think we have to break our thinking, change our relations with the People's Republic of China to end almost a half-century of our engagement policies where we tried to support communism in China. I believe those days should be over. This is actually already the direction that we're heading. There were twin speeches in October of last year by Vice President Mike Pence and by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. They contained confrontational language that we have not heard from a senior American leader, at least in public. We first started hearing of a new tone about China in December 2017 with President Trump's first national security strategy. That national security strategy talked about China in realistic terms. It didn't use the words friend and partner. Instead, it called China and its de facto ally Russia rivals and revisionist powers. We heard even more striking language from Pompeo at the Hudson Institute, where he gave a speech in October, and he spoke in extremely candid tones. Quote, "It is," he said, referring to China's Communist Party, "it is no longer realistic to ignore the fundamental differences between our 2 systems and the impact that those 2 systems have on American national security." He called the Communist Party a Marxist-Leninist group that was focused on struggle and international domination, and he reminded his audience that we Americans don't have to summarize the hostility of Chinese leaders, all we have to do is to listen to their words. Indeed, we do. Second thing that we need to do is we need to mobilize our society to develop, commercialize, and protect our intellectual property. So for instance, we need to emphasize STEM education. We need to ramp up federal government support for technology. And we also need to end most forms of tech cooperation with China. And as we figure out what we must do to protect our society, we should think about what's at stake. What is at stake? Well, I believe it's everything. Thank you. We're going to take questions.
All right.
Unless, of course, you all agreed with me.
We came here to hear you, not to eat, but the food will be coming. Thank you so much, Gordon. I appreciate that. I took a lot of notes, but I'll leave it. I'll let those here ask questions first. Any questions?
We got one over there.
Stephen.
Yes, thank you. This notion of the NCI, what I summarize here is Chinese orientation, domination of a unified world under its hegemony.
Right.
It seems to be consistent, not to get too much into politics, with the orientation of a good portion of Western elites.
Of what?
Western elites. So we can say that the abolition of national sovereignty, the undoing of Westphalia, I would say is in the interest, not in the interest, but something supported by the portion of Western elites. So, if we were to confront China in a fundamental way, how can we count on Western unity, cooperation in such an undertaking?
Yeah, that's a great question because you point out the fact that the whole notion of sovereignty, the whole notion of a Westphalian system is being eroded because we do talk in terms of maybe not one worldism anymore, but we do talk about the erosion of sovereignty because we have things like Paris Treaty Accord on climate change, all sorts of important agreements that countries have entered into. And there is this notion that we are one people. But all of that still is in the context of competing countries. Because even the Paris Accord, for instance, is signed by all of these countries. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has like 195 signatories. Those signatories are countries. I think the answer to your question is, as we face a challenge from China, how are we going to deal with it in a notion that we are moving toward a different type of world? I think two things. First of all, we are seeing that China is pushing countries into ways and into opposition to itself. The United States doesn't want to oppose China. That's the last thing that we want. We went through one Cold War. We were done with that. We talked about the end of history and all the rest of it, but China has sort of put history, the end of history, on hold, and we're now back to that confrontation. A lot of people talk about the new Cold War. Well, it has been going on, and China has been driving it. So that, I think, will force countries into a different position. We can sort of see this in the second thing, and that is when Trump talks about America first, which is fascinating because of the implications. I don't know what's in his mind when he uses that term, but obviously he does believe that countries should compete in a framework, and he believes that every national leader should put the interests of their own country first, which is the way the system works anyway, even though we do talk about one world type stuff. So that's where we're moving. And we're seeing this movement not only in the United States, but of course in Europe as well, which is the home of this sort of unified transnational organization called the European Union, which it sort of typifies sort of how far things have gone in terms of the erosion of national sovereignty. You see, of course, Brexit, and you're seeing other countries also consider leaving the European Union. You see the rise of populist candidates actually becoming national leaders. So that's the way we're going. I think we've sort of hit the high point of this notion of shared sovereignty, the whole notion of global governance. It is just, I think, pretty much over. But even if it weren't, the Chinese would kill it off. because they are attacking our societies. And people in this country and elsewhere are starting to have a different appreciation for the challenges that China poses. Not everyone sees it as I do in such stark terms, but if you look across the American political spectrum, China is believed to be a bad actor. What you don't hear is you don't hear a consensus on solutions. But for instance, I think one of the most stark things, and I'll leave you with this, how things have changed in terms of perceptions of China, is that maybe not the candidates who are running for the Democratic nomination, but the establishment Democrats do support President Trump on things like tariffs. So for instance, Minority Leader Schumer, House Speaker Pelosi, they very much even have a tougher view than President Trump does on trade. So we're moving in a very different direction, which is a corrective from the way we viewed China just 3 or 4 years ago.
There is a question right there. Yes.
Hi. How about Latin America? There's a region where, we see both Chinese and Russian expansion and intervention is in Latin America. I'm from El Salvador, and you saw, like very recently, the announcements that were made in a country like El Salvador, which is very, very small. So you think, why? And also, if you look at places like Venezuela, there's a Reuters story today about how Maduro is going to go ahead and just, give the oil to both the Russians and the Chinese. And also in Argentina. So what do you see as the implications to the U.S. from such, activity and such an expansion?
Yeah, the question, if you didn't hear it, was generally looking at China's and Russia's activities in our hemisphere and what are the implications for that. And I think the best example was the one you gave, which is Venezuela, where you have both the Russians and the Chinese have military bases there and have been the main supporters of Maduro in his contest with Juan Guaido. So clearly they're backstopping that. China especially has an involvement, which is maybe less military linked than Russia's, but certainly more economic, because China is a big taker of Venezuelan crude and will continue to do so. And China has, at one point, extended something like $70 billion to Venezuela. People say that amount is down to 23 billion. Some people say 15 billion. It's still a substantial amount that Venezuela owes China, and which explains Venezuela's behavior when it comes to issues involving China. So obviously they are a major factor in our own hemisphere. And with those guys come, just to take an example, the Irans of the world, which are also active in our hemisphere, and I think probably get some support from the Russians and the Chinese in terms of the Iranian behavior, which obviously has been malign with the attack on the Jewish community in Argentina, I believe. So what we're talking about is bad actors messing around in this hemisphere. And as you noticed, John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, repudiated the Monroe Doctrine. That came back in the Trump administration, which is not to say that we get to determine what goes on in our hemisphere, but it does say that other countries should not be exercising hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, which is probably a good thing. So I think we're going to find more conflict. We conflict with China, and I talked about tech, because tech really is important. And we talked a little bit about the economy, and there's all ranges of things that we now have a confrontation with China on, and Venezuela is just another one of them. So we're going to see this friction across the board as China and the U.S., well, I should say, as we speak more plainly about the matters that affect us with regard to those two countries.
Stephen.
Huawei, we had a ban or keeps on getting extended of selling hardware to them. What is the status of that?
Another great question. Just to put this in context, in May of this year, President Trump had the Commerce Department add Huawei to its entity list. And this meant that no American company could contract with Huawei without getting, on tech matters, without getting prior approval of the Commerce Department. As soon as that entity designation was made, President Trump made sure there was a 90-day waiver, it was a general waiver, and there have been now, I think, 3 waivers. And so there's still basically a waiver. In addition to that, Commerce Department has been granting specific approvals to American companies to sell designated items to Huawei. So for instance, Micron Technologies can now sell certain chips to Huawei. Commerce Department basically takes the position that they're going to allow sales to Huawei of equipment that Huawei could get from the Japanese or the South Koreans. So what they are saying is, we don't want American companies to lose out. I think that Commerce Secretary Ross is being, actually, well, he must be getting this from President Trump. I think he's being a little bit unambitious because both Japan and South Korea are our allies, and if we really leaned on them, we could get them not to sell chips to China. And if we weren't to sell chips to China, Huawei would be out of business, basically. China is developing its own replacement chips, but it's still a couple years behind in terms of being able to do that. So Huawei would be in trouble. The other place where Huawei is in trouble, and this is going to be absolutely fascinating, is Huawei, as I mentioned, is the world's second largest maker of cell phones. It sells cell phones in China with, it's an Android system, and they sell them without a license from Google for the Play Store. So there are a lot of important Google apps you don't get in China, but you were never going to get them. But Huawei is now trying to sell its most recent cell phone around the world without the license from Google, and it's having a hard time because people want Google apps. So this is a good thing, but we're going to have this competition. The problem fundamentally goes back to President Trump's, we did the same thing with ZTE, which is another Chinese telecom equipment manufacturer. We put them on the entity list, and then we took them off the entity list because we thought they'd play nice. But in Venezuela, ZTE has sold Dell equipment under conditions which violate their settlement agreement with the Justice Department, and we didn't do anything, which is our fault. So it's a mess. To answer your question, we should be doing more.
What about Israel? I mean, I know China's over in Israel all the time trying to steal technology or foreign technology. Why is Israelis cooperating with this?
Because the United States has not put the hard word on Netanyahu, which we should be doing. Just as I think we should be going after the South Koreans, going after the Japanese, going after everybody else who sells Huawei stuff. We haven't been doing that, so we haven't been going after Israel. I believe that we should be going after and making sure that none of these countries sell technology or license technology or let the Chinese buy technology in these countries.
Are we waiting for phase 2 in order to do these things, or we're not at all?
Yeah, phase 2 refers to the trade agreement. Phase 1 is being signed on the 15th of this month. And a lot of the hard issues have been relegated to what's called phase 2. Phase 2 is basically state subsidies, state industrial policies, which we believe violate China's World Trade Organization obligations, in addition to other things. Those have been put off. I don't think there'll ever be a phase 2. And the reason is that these are central to the way Xi Jinping views the way China should develop. He believes that there should be very little room, not only for foreigners, he also believes there should be very little room for private Chinese entrepreneurs in the Chinese system. So he believes in state enterprises. So when you can't get someone like that to say, well, we're no longer going to support state enterprises with subsidies. We're no longer going to have these massive industrial programs. So I don't think phase 2 is really going to be likely.
Let's get a couple more questions. Joel, and then Tony, and then Joel first.
I heard, I've read recently that the Chinese are very interested in the Solomon Islands, and nobody else is. If that's the case, what does that portend for Australia if they're successful?
This is a really important point. Solomon's is where Guadalcanal is. A lot of American blood that was spilled in World War II in taking those islands. And the U.S., not to its credit, and this is not the fault of any one president, but a lot of them, has basically neglected the South Pacific, which is an incredibly important area for a lot of reasons we don't have a chance to go into tonight. American policy for the last 5 years has really been to take the South Pacific and say to Canberra and to New Zealand and Australia, you deal with it. And Australian and New Zealand management of that part of the world has been a little bit rapacious, has not really gone down very well. So that's opened up all opportunities for China throughout the Pacific, not just the Solomons. And so we've got a situation where we're now starting to push back. We're starting to recognize the strategic importance of it, but we're late in the game.
But you have a country that is acting as a country to interfere in business all over the world, whereas that's the antithesis of what we stand for, or have stood for, that our companies are independent.
And the other thing about what China has done throughout the Pacific, and this is especially noticeable in Tonga, is that they come in and they corrupt the entire political system. They bring in all sorts of crime that did not exist. So you've got not only just the bribing of officials, but you've got slave trade, all sorts of horrible things, prostitution. And that really has been really China's method of operation throughout the Pacific. And this is just, I mean, for that reason alone, forget about geopolitical competition. What China's been doing to these fragile and small societies is really horrific.
Now, I'm sorry, but now that you've said all this, you've also said that the Chinese people in large groups, large numbers of Chinese people are very unhappy. They're not being well served by their government in any way. So that seems to be competing possibilities.
Yeah, well, just look at Hong Kong, for instance. I mean, there's a lot of, there is unrest.
But go on the mainland.
I know.
Are there areas where a large number of people are able to, appreciate what's happening?
In 2018, you had protests across China among various groups. So you had mothers, you had army veterans, you had stock investors. These protests just spiraled, just spread throughout China. 2019 was relatively quiet. We're now starting to see protests again, in part inspired by what's going on in Hong Kong, which is supposed to be a semi-autonomous region of the People's Republic. So I think we're going to start to see that again. The other thing that's happening is the economy. Chinese economy is slumping right now, and that is going to cause more and more unrest as we go forward. It's not growing at the 6% pace that the Beijing claims. It's growing at a pace which is probably in reality slower than ours. And it's piling up debt. We're seeing all sorts of defaults across the financial system, bond defaults. So this is going to take a toll on the popularity of the Communist Party. And